Welcome to What's Happening. If you ever pulled up to the job site, grabbed that piece of equipment you need to finish up a job, only to find it doesn't work. Now you're losing valuable time and money to drop it off at a repair shop.
Well, today we're going to help change that. We're joined by Sean Carrier from the Denver Hardwood Pro Shop. Sean has been trained by the largest companies in sanding and fastening equipment. And Sean today is going to show us how to tear down and clean out a Super 7 edger.
That is correct. We're going to go through that Super 7, tear it down, put it back together, show you some of the basic maintenance. It is the #1 edger we see in here at the Denver Hardwood Pro Shop. So let's see what we can do and tear one down, guys.
Lead the way.
Sounds great. And this is a good time to review that before you do any maintenance, always wear your eye protection.
With a nice clean bench, flat surface, let's flip our edger upside down and let's get started. Grab your paper wrench, spin off your paper bolt, take off the paper, grab your screwdriver, put it into the gears on the left side of the main support, grab your pad wrench, 1 or 2 hits should pap it free. Once that is done, spin off the pad, inspect the outer rim for the edge to make sure it's still there, as well as for dings or cracks in the rubber. Check the outer top surface, make sure it's in good shape. Grab your impact wrench and take out your disc guard screws, always making sure it's running in the right direction. You can also do this with a Phillips head screwdriver, whatever one you may have. Once you have that off, then what you want to do is inspect the brass ring. Make sure it's not full of dirt, because they commonly do get full of dirt, and on the other side of the disc cover. Check for your fiber washer, make sure that's there, take it out. Then we're to taking the gear cover off. Mark where your pinion gear is, which is at the main support, and then we always date it of when we were last in it. Use a screwdriver or the impact wrench to take the screws out. When you do get the screws out, make sure you get the rubber seal off the screw as well. They can stick, you'll leave them. Sure enough, they'll pop off when you don't want them and you can't find them. So take a screwdriver, pop them off. Once you got that, it should just pull out. If it doesn't, you may have to take a pad, put it on it, 2 pry bars, and pop it out. Once that is out, check your main gear for wear, which is feeling for a roughness or sharpness. So be careful when you do this, you don't cut yourself. It can get quite sharp. But the main gear and the pinion gear, if ever changed, should always be changed together. Check your load spring, make sure there is actually good spring to it, it's not flattened out. Look at your grease and inspect the grease as well. If it's all in good shape, let's move on to taking off the pinion gear. The pinion gear is left-handed thread. Put your screwdriver on the left side of the main support there, turning and pulling back towards you. Make sure you don't pull that too hard and your hand's in the way and you give yourself a nice cut. We've done it plenty of times. Once again, the pinion gear is left-handed thread. You can now usually spin that off. On some of your older edgers, you may have to use a wrench all the way. If you do try to take your pad off and it sticks and then tightens, it's your pinion gear that came loose, not your pad. From there, we'll move on to the casters. Always seeing how much movement you have up and down. That's checking your lower upper bearings. It's the lower of the upper bearings that tends to go. Make sure they're spinning and also make sure the caster is rolling well. Once you're ready to take them off, just a pair of pliers and a 7/16 speed wrench. Just wedge the pair of pliers in there, turn the bolt out, and it'll drop out with a bearing and a spacer on it. Caster will come out the other side. Make sure you pull the other bearing out. That is the bearing that takes most of your load, especially if you got guys that lean on it. Once you have that, we'll go ahead and do the second wheel, pop it out, same inspection. Check the bearings, make sure you don't have a lot of movement up and down in them, and they are rolling nice and easy. A lot of times people want to replace these and you don't need to. You can just wash them out in the part washer and they'll go move right along just fine. Once that is done, flip the edger over. This is why I like taking the wheels off. You got a nice flat surface. With that done, we'll take the first switch plate off on the right side using an impact wrench. If you're using that, once again, make sure it's going the right direction. Once you got that one off, then we'll pull the switch side off, and you can use a Phillips head for this as well. Use a 9/16 speed wrench to take off the nut to the switch, and make sure you don't lose your switch dial. Once you got that, pull up the switch and the spacer washer underneath it. Take your electrical tape off. Some of these old edgers may not have electrical tape, not uncommon. Start taking your screws out of the switch. Make sure you don't drop them into the edger. It's not fun trying to find them. If you notice, I always keep a finger on them. It's out of habit to make sure it doesn't get lost. Now this side here, they got the light wires hooking to this side. The light wires should always hook to your hot side. So your light wires, your light's always running when the edger's not running. Go ahead and pull them screws. We'll leave the black wire hooked up. That goes to the brush block, and you can leave it hooked up. We'll pull the vent on the front, and we'll pull the brush spring. The brush spring you push in, move to the right, let it come back. Inspect the coil to make sure it is tight, no spacing in there, and no debris is in there. Clean it out, make sure it's all working well. Check your brush. You should have some distance of the brush back from the brush block, which is the silver. If you do, you should have a good enough brush to keep that brush, keep using that brush. If it is in too far, you should replace the brushes. Go around, pull the other brush springs, the other vent, inspecting them all at the same time. If you replace one brush spring, you most likely should replace them all. Once that is done, we grab our impact wrench, take out the screws on the top head. Once we have them out, then we'll take our arms or hands underneath the two handles with an upward motion, hit it upwards, but be careful not to hit so hard and out of control you throw the top. We wouldn't want that. And you notice there's one white wire. That will disconnect and mark where it went. And also make sure you check your load spring. It's in good shape in the top as well. We'll push the edger to the back, bring the top of the edger back over, and then we're going to inspect the brushes to make sure everything's working properly in the brush block, because you can get dust up in there to where they won't work properly or move like they should. Make sure everything's tight, wires aren't burnt. Once that's done, we'll go back to the edger and check the top arm bearing, inspect it. To get it started, to get it off, 2 pry bars, start down about halfway, stop. If you go too far, you'll damage the comm. Go to a bearing puller. Mine takes a 1/2 inch speed wrench. Finish taking off that bearing. Once that bearing is off, we'll move down to the lamp guard. Pull the screw on it, take the lamp guard off. That puts us into the light bulb. They do have a new LED light bulb if you're not familiar with that current one. Once that's out of the way, and then we pull the lamp socket screw out. Once we get that out of the way, then we can pull the first bolt to the center of the body of the edger. Using an impact wrench is what I use. You can use a Phillips. Using a 3/16 wrench, pull the Allen bolts from the back. They're usually not terribly tight, but you do want them pretty snug when you do put them back. Once that is off, then we can lift the center and take it up and over the comm. Be careful not to damage the comm. Sometimes you can have it pretty tight. So you might have to wiggle it a little bit, and every once in a while you might have to tap it to pop that center loose. Once that's done, lift it up over. Inspect your field. Make sure you're looking for burnt wires, melted wires, partially rubbed through wires. Any damage like that, make sure it's taken care of. Hot wires become a natural resistor. More resistance is more amps. Amps aren't good. Then we work on taking the armature out. To get the armature out, we'll use 2 pry bars, right underneath the fins. And this is why we pull the pinion gear. So to pull the pinion gear off, why this top is off, is more difficult than if we just did it ahead of time. So with 2 pry bars against the fins as extra support to protect the fan for the motor, pop the armature out. Sometimes this will take some wiggling. Get your gasket out of the way, put it to the side. Then we take out the spacer that's below the armature, making note there is a flange on the bottom of this spacer. That must go down towards the bearing, not up. Then you have a bearing seal and a bearing underneath that. If you need to replace that bearing, pull the seal. That's just a pry bar wedged in, pop it out. You will damage it, you will need a new one. Snap ring pliers, pop out the bearing. Then we go on to the field. On the field, you can do a continuity test to it, which we'll do right now. And all you're listening for is a beep. And that means you have a current going through and you have no broken wire on the field. The reading it's doing is irrelevant. All you're looking is hearing for a tone that says it's good. Now the reading we want, because we just moved to 200 on the ohm setting, we'll do a test. We want 0.6, 0.7. You get 0.8, 0.9, you're getting too high. Sometimes you will have to wiggle the wires to get that reading, but it's not absolute either. Unfortunately, all this testing we may talk about, none of it's absolute. Then we go to the brush block. Make sure your impact wrench is going in the right direction. Pull the 4 screws on the brush block. Make sure you know exactly how that brush block came out. It wouldn't be a bad idea probably to benchmark it. Put a mark on it and a mark on your body so you know exactly how it goes back together. And then lift it out. Put it back in, just the opposite. All right, put the edger back together. We drop the brush block into place, matching up your benchmarking that you put on it. Put 1 screw in about 90% of the way using your impact wrench. Put the other screw in, and then you know your brush block is lined up properly. You can tighten that one up, go back to the first one, tighten it up. Once you got that, go ahead and put the other 2 in. They just basically need to be snug. They don't have to be super tight or anything. Once we have that done, check your brushes, make sure they're moving properly. And then to change a brush, the easiest way to change brushes is with the top off in my mind. Just pull your wire off, pull it back, take it out. And if a brush is running properly, you should have a mirror effect to it or very shiny and smooth. If you have silt built up on it or a real roughness to it, that tells you your comm is rough. It may not be in good condition. That's what you want to see. And always change all 4 brushes at the same time. To put it back in, I like to have the brush wire spun a half a turn, line it up, push it through the brush block, take your needle nose pliers, push it onto the clip, push the brush back, make sure they're all back, because otherwise it's not going to set on top of the comm. Getting ready to put the armature back in, we must first put the spacer in, making sure the flange is down towards the bearing. Once you have that, then we can drop in the armature. Sometimes they'll slide in. Generally, you don't want them just to slide in. You should take a plastic mallet or dead blow mallet, tap it a few times till you hear it nice and solid. Once it's solid, you know you're good. I like to spin it once or twice, double checking that lower bearing and everything is correct. Put our gasket back into place. Then we're ready to put on the centerpiece. Centerpiece will slide over, being careful of the comm, that we don't hit it or damage it. You may have to tap the centerpiece down a little bit, sometimes with a plastic mallet or dead blow mallet. Once that is done, take your 2 Allen bolts, drop them into place, tighten them up once again with a 3/16 Allen wrench. Pretty tight, not super tight. Remember, these are into aluminum. Aluminum you can strip out. Once that is tight, then we'll move to the front bolt. Front bolt I like to put in with a impact wrench Once again, just be careful, don't overdo it. Just a couple little hits from the impact is all you need. It's not very tight once again. Once you have that, then we can move on to the light socket. Now the light socket's a little different. You'll have your washer on the back side of the light socket once you've put your nut through. Once it's through, then the washer. That helps it ground for sure to the edger body is what that's doing. Straighten out your light socket to be parallel to the base. Grab the top. I love the new edgers here because you can set it on the stack. Where we marked where our field wire came off, we'll put that back on, making sure you have a tight connection. Now, the number one mistake I see almost everybody do here, which I did when I first started working on, make sure you tuck that field wire up and in so you don't damage it. Then we'll go ahead and put on your bearing. I use a old socket that lines up with the outside of the race. Make sure you hit the races. You can't hit the seals, you'll damage the bearing. Tap it on. Once that is on, making sure your load spring is in place, and if it doesn't stay in place, use a little dab of grease. Once that's done, slide it over easily, maybe a little wiggle to make sure brushes are out of the way. A couple little hits with your hand usually tightens it down nicely. Then we'll slide in the 4 head bolts. Now the back bolt that I last just put in, you want to check the black wire. Make sure it's in front of the wire, not behind it, so you're pinching it. Once that is done, then we use a screw gun set to 12. I have this one set at, but you have to watch. My other screw gun I have in the shop, we only set at 10. So they're not all exactly the same, so don't just use my setting. When you go to put the screw in, make sure you have a lot of down pressure so you don't strip out that screw. Go ahead and tighten them all down. Once you have that, now we'll move to that back to that field wire and make sure it doesn't move into the comm, because if you leave it where it is, it could do that. So what we'll do is we'll tuck it in between the field and the center body. Once it gets tucked down in there, then I do like to take a pair of pliers to really make sure it's in there and give it a slight bend so it holds back. As you're doing this, you'll probably see what I'm talking about. We'll try to get the best shot we can of this. But you do want that field wire tucked down in there. Once you have all that done, go to the brush springs. Slide the brush springs in, push in, then to the left, and then let go, and it should be in place. One thing to watch for, though, is make sure the spring, it's towards the outside. It's not wedged in between the brush block and the brush. So slight angle, slide it in, push it to the left, release it. Then we go back to the switch. Some of these wires can feel like spaghetti, all tangled up. I like to get them straightened out, get them roughly running where they need to run. Now your black wire is your hot wire, your white wire is your neutral wire of your source. They actually run underneath the switch to the far side of the switch, and your field wire and brush block wire run to the opposite side. Your light wire should always hook up to your source wire or power coming into the edger. I like to take the wire fittings and make the flats go back to each other. That way they seem to line up, at least for me, easier while putting them into the switch. Always keep a finger on your screws as you do this, because once before I think I mentioned you don't want to drop a screw in an edger and have to take it back apart to find that screw. Because if you can't find it, you got to find it. I always like to hook up the black wire first, then the white wire, and when you are tightening these wires, make sure you don't over tighten them. You can pop out the side of the switch, switch is fried, you're putting a new switch in. So it's just snug, not very tight at all. Then we take a flashlight, look down inside, make sure all the wires have stayed out of the way and they're not pushed into the comm. Once everything looks good, 2 wraps of tape is plenty on the switch just to safeguard in case it comes loose, it doesn't hit or ground out on the metal. Once we have that, now the nut, what you want to do is line that up with that little pin where it's just below that pin, and that'll give the proper height setting to the switch where it's not higher than the edger. Put your spacer washer in, your switch plate on, switch plate dial, and then your nut. This is a 9/16, so we'll use our speed wrench again. And it's just snug. It's not real tight at all. Using your screw gun, go ahead and put the switch plate on, making sure it's only on setting of 1. These aren't tight at all. Pop the screws in. And when you push the switch in, your wires may move to the side. So we want to recheck and make sure them wires didn't move into the comm. If all that looks good, then we're ready to turn the edger upside down and put the bottom together. To further inspect your grease, the thing you're looking for is if it's liquefied, no good. If it's starting to turn like taffy, real stiff and gooey, no good. And it takes 6 ounces of grease if you do completely wash that out to replace it. Once we're ready to put on the pinion gear and the load spring, we set that in first, making sure the spring side is up, because you want that touching the outer race. So that's the proper way it goes in. But if they have lost their spring, you should replace it. Slide our pinion gear on. It'll go so far. And remember, this is left-handed thread. So off is on. Take it down as much as we can, making sure our wrench is in really good shape so we don't slip off or strip. But now our screwdriver is on the other side of the brace into the fan and tighten it up. Here, you want this pretty snug. You're going to put some oomph to it to make sure that pinion gear is nice and tight. If you ever take your pad off and it loosens and retightens, your pinion gear came loose, not your pad. So lining up the mark that we put on the gear cover case with the main brace of the body of the edger, that tells you exactly where the indentation that is made for the pinion gear to go. Because if you don't put this cover back on correctly over top of that pinion gear, it's going to rub against the top of the gear cover case, making sure our load spring's in, making sure our line lines up with that main brace, and so it lines up with the pinion gear. With a slight slant, put it into the gear hits the pinion gear, slide it down in, making sure the impact or screw gun is set to 1, because these are not very tight. And the rubber seals on these, just because they get a little damaged doesn't mean you have to replace them. Basically, they might be oozing out of the side as you press the screw down. Not a big deal unless that rubber is gone completely. Once you got the screws put into the gear unit cover, then I like to take a screwdriver down into the fan, spin the fan just a little bit, make sure everything turning fine, nothing's bound, and things look good. Then we can grab our disc guard, slide it on. If you have a lot of slack in this, you should replace the disc guard. That's that brass ring. The brass ring wears down. As it wears down, you get more slack, you get more dinging on your pad. The only way to fix that, replace the disc guard. Do not be peening your disc guard washer, because all that's going to do is ruin it and you'll have to replace it as well. Once again, make sure we're set to 1 on the screw gun. These are not very tight. I get one screw in about 50% of the way, put the other screw in to make sure they line up. Once they got lined up, I'll tighten them 2 screws up and put in the other 2 behind it. Once you got them 2 screws in, give your guard a spin, make sure everything's working correctly. Once that is done, then we put our fiber washer in. The main reason for this fiber washer is you put 2 foreign metals together, aluminum and steel, they'll naturally corrode. This stops that from happening or the pad from sticking on. Probably one of the #1 mistakes people do, they get the pad too tight. Don't just spin it real hard and let it lock down too tight. You want to take it down. When you get slowly close to it, slow down, let it stop, Put a screwdriver in the fan with some pressure down, one little push, maybe two, you're done. That's it. Moving on to the wheels, we've inspected our bearings, making sure they're in good shape. Take your bolt, put it through the bearing, put your spacer on, put it up into the caster. Take your second bearing, drop it down on, then mount your caster on. Making sure you don't have a lot of slack in the bearing there. If you do have a lot of movement there, you need new casters. And just like we took it apart, just the opposite, pair of pliers wedged into the top, the 7/16 speed wrench. Make sure you got good roll and good spin. This is the second one going in. Got your bolt, got your bearing, your spacer. Drop the second bearing on top. Put your caster on. Tighten it down. Making sure you check everything is spinning and rolling correctly like it should. Now that the wheels are on, flip it back over. Let's put our LED light bulb back in. Let's put the lamp guard back on. Using your screw gun, once again, not very tight. Just snug it. Then we can put our latch switch plate back on because we leave these off and the vents off so we can inspect wires as we work on it, making sure everything's out of the way. Put the clutch to 1. They're not tight at all. Now every once in a while on your vents, you may have to take a pair of needle nose and bend the little flanges back because they'll get bent down and they won't hold the vent in, and you might just have to bend them back out. Put the vents on.
Now we're ready to go ahead and set the edger. Set the edger down, moving it forward so the wheels are facing backwards. Make sure the lock nuts are loose. Take 3 pennies. Set it underneath the left side of the edger if everything's correct, which this one is set correct. Then we slide it to the right side, making sure we're the same there.